Good morning and welcome to this talk. I'm Peter Dubowski. I'm the rector of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and I am very, very honored to welcome among us Professor Schwartz. This talk, as many of you students and professors know, is about the book of Maccabees. The book of Maccabees has not been taught here at the Biblicum for many, many years, so this is an excellent moment for everyone to get involved and to be introduced to the book of Maccabees. And we are also very pleased to have Professor Schwartz with us, because this is a long tradition of the collaboration of the Pontifical Biblical Institute with Israeli and Jewish scholars. And so those of you who are a bit older, you know that here we had Israel Finkelstein, we have Emmanuel Tov, we have Amy Gilles Levine, we have Carol and Eric Myers, and many, many other Jewish and Israeli scholars. And we are very pleased also that this talk is organized in collaboration with Centro Bea. Centro Bea, those of you who don't know, is a center of Jewish studies, Christian Jewish studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University. And in the view of integration, so this is the next step we are doing together. So I will pass the word now to Professor Massimo Gargiulo, who will introduce Professor Schwartz. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everybody. And first, let me thank the rector of the Biblicum, Father Dubowski, and also the dean of the Biblical Faculty, Father Patarumadatil. As the Cardinal Bea Centre, we are very happy to work together with the Biblicum Institute, given the affinities of the fields we cover and of the studies that we offer. And I'm very happy to have here Professor Schwartz, whom I am introducing shortly. And he will give a talk of about 1 hour, after which we will have time for question and answer. The session will be closed by about 12. So, Professor Daniel Schwartz is a professor of Jewish history at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and currently he is here in Rome as a Brennimeyer Verhan guest professor at the Cardinal Bea Centre. He is specialized in Jewish history of the Second Temple period and in the Greco-Roman context. And he has published translations and commentaries about the books of First and Second Maccabees, which will be the topic of his talk today. So thank you very much, Professor Schwartz, for being here, and I'll leave the floor to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Professor Gargiulo. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here today. I taught in the PBI in Jerusalem for many years in the 1980s, and I think this is my first time back since then. And I am honored and hope it will be worth your time to hear me speak. I thank Professor Patarumadatil, for the invitation to speak here today, and Professor Dubowski for running the whole operation. I particularly want to thank Federica Sozzi, who was standing by the door a minute ago, and she runs the Bea Centre basically and gets everything done. All of you people have been putting in a lot of work, and I hope to make it justified. Professor Dubowski spoke about the book of Maccabees, if I heard him correctly, which is a very common way of speaking about the books of Maccabees. The difference between the book of Maccabees and the books of Maccabees is precisely what I want to talk about now. But I can tell you that it's common everywhere for people to speak about the book as if it's one book, like Kings is a book which has 1st and 2nd Kings, Samuel is a book which has 1st and 2nd Samuel. And if you don't remember anything else from this lecture, it's not that way with 1st and 2nd Maccabees. They're two very different books. They look the same. If you go to the standard edition from Göttingen, they look just the same. It's just one happens to be volume 9, part 1, and the other is volume 9, part 2. And even externally, when you start looking at the external data about the books, they are very similar. They both exist in Greek, and everything else which we have is a translation from the Greek. You have here at the Biblicum Professor Sievers, who's now in Jerusalem. He put out many years ago a synopsis of 1st Maccabees against Josephus, which basically shows that Josephus's version of the same story in Antiquities 12 and 13 was based on the Greek version of 1st Maccabees as well. So already by the 1st century, Josephus doesn't seem to have had access to the Hebrew text of 1st Maccabees, to which I'll get in a moment. The books are basically the same length, one's 15, one's 16 chapters. They're basically on the same topic, namely the Judean revolt against the Seleucids, on the background of some persecution of Judaism by Antiochus IV. The story begins in both books essentially in 175 BCE, which is when Antiochus IV accedes to the throne. Antiochus IV, and according to 1st Maccabees, his successors as well, because 1st Maccabees goes longer, are the villains of the story. Judah Maccabee, and according to 1st Maccabees, his brothers, again because the story goes on longer, is the main hero of 1st and 2nd Maccabees. So they have a lot in common, and what I want to suggest to you is they have a lot more and more meaningful, which is not in common. Namely, they are two very different books, and I will try and argue that under 3 headings. The first will give you some basic characteristics of the books. The second will talk about the difference between a Judean book and a Jewish book from the Diaspora, outside of Judea or outside of the land of Israel. And the third one will push the second one and argue basically that it's not just the difference between a Jew abroad and a Jew in Judea, it's the difference between a Jew and a Judean. And I will have something of a question mark about the extent to which Judeans then are, by definition at least, Jews. Let's start with some basics. First basic has to do with language. 1st Maccabees was composed in late biblical Hebrew. 2nd Maccabees was composed in Greek. I have here a slide of the first 9 or 10 verses of 1st Maccabees in Kapler's edition, 1936. And I colored yellow all of these places where you have kai, and a finite verb. Once I taught a seminar in which I had Greek students and Israeli students, and we were reading 1st and 2nd Maccabees. The Israelis loved reading 1st Maccabees because it's like reading Hebrew. All of kai. I put on the side here some examples. Vayhi, vayach, vayimroch, vayaroch, vayishchat, vayerech, vayikach. Like that. And the Greeks were making faces and saying, what kind of a book is this? And the answer is it's translation, very Slavish translation, from biblical Hebrew. Jerome says it was in Hebrew. There are some mistranslations in the book which prove it was in Hebrew, and then with some cases in which the Greek text shows you that somebody was misreading an unvocalized Hebrew text. And there's Hebrew style of the type I illustrated. So nobody, I think, has ever doubted that 1st Maccabees was originally in Hebrew, and maybe someday it will be discovered. Anytime they put down a new sewage line in Alexandria or Israel, it could happen that somebody will find something, but in the meantime, it hasn't been found. 2nd Maccabees was originally in Greek specifically of the 2nd century BCE. When I was translating 2nd Maccabees into Hebrew and then into English, the best dictionary I found for the particular nuances of the words is a dictionary somebody made for the Greek of Polybius, who was a 2nd century Greek historian here in Rome. I give you here an example of what's so Greek about Second Maccabees. If the text of First Maccabees had so many finite verbs, the first 3 verses of Second Maccabees' story, which begins in chapter 3, the first 2 chapters are some preliminary material I'm going to skip now. The first 3 verses of the story of Second Maccabees have only one finite verb. Namely, at the beginning of verse 2, you have "it happened." Everything else is participles, which make one phrase dependent on another phrase, which is the way the Greeks do their writing when they're doing nice writing. This is what the Greeks in my class liked, and this is what the Israelis found very hard to deal with after 1 or 2 years of introductory Greek. First Maccabees has numerous allusions to the Hebrew Bible. It uses phrases, it uses motifs from the Hebrew Bible, which the author knows and which the author assumes, I suppose, that the readers know. Knows the bookshelf of the author and the bookshelf of the intended readership was a bookshelf which contained the books of the Hebrew Bible. I've been engaged in the last several years in a project to retrovert First Maccabees into biblical Hebrew, and all we ever do is just sit there with a concordance to the Septuagint and see, well, what Greek word in the Septuagint, what does this Greek word in the Septuagint correspond to an extant Hebrew text? And then let's see if it'll work for First Maccabees as well. Here, for example, you have in the beginning of chapter 5, you have the Gentiles round about heard that the altar had been built and the temple rededicated as they previously were. They were very wrathful. That's straight out of Nehemiah chapter 4. As the neighboring Gentiles hear that the Jews are building something in Jerusalem, and that upsets them. So they decide to wipe out the people of Jacob, Zerah Yaakov, and who does Judah fight against? He fights against the sons of Esau. Nobody in the Second Temple period calls the Edomites the sons of Esau, but the author of First Maccabees is using that biblical term to clarify to why is there hostility between Jews and their neighbors, because Jacob and Esau had their problems in the days of the Bible, and this is another round of that later on. Or in First Maccabees 14, when everything is wonderful in the days of Simon, the author says it's wonderful insofar as each sat under his vine and under his fig tree, which is a common biblical phrase for things being wonderful. Second Maccabees has very few allusions to the Hebrew Bible. There's one complex of allusions which is very important, and beyond that about nothing. But it does have allusions to Greek literature. Antiochus, it says in chapter 5, was so arrogant that after he stole 1,800 talents from the temple, he departed to Antioch, thinking in his arrogance to make the land navigable, and in the soaring of his heart to make the sea walkable. He's going to go by ship on land and walk on the sea. That's straight out of Herodotus's description of Xerxes, who wants to walk across the Hellespont, and therefore he has his people try to make a bridge, and he wants to sail across the Athos Peninsula, and therefore he has his people build a tunnel, and this is repeated time and again in antiquity as a standard topos illustrating arrogance. Eleazar, in chapter 6, is the first main martyr of the book, and the king is demanding that he eat things that is forbidden to eat, and he refuses. So the king offers to let him pretend he's eating these things and save his life thereby, and he gives the speech about wanting to be a paradigm for the youth and die nobly rather than pretend to have given in to these. And this is all straight out of Plato's Crito. And I give you here these passages where the emphasis is on what kind of example, paradigm, will this be for the youth. First Maccabees has a restrained style similar to the style of the Hebrew Bible. I mentioned before Jacob and Esau. When Jacob sells his buys the birthright from Esau in Genesis, well, what does Esau do? He eats and he drinks and he gets up and he leaves, and there isn't even a single word to say he was angry. Maybe we should infer. Or when Isaac goes with Abraham to the Akedah, to the potential sacrifice of Isaac, you wonder, what did Isaac think on the way? What did he feel on the way? Not a word. That's the style of Hebrew narrative. The end of chapter 1 of 1 Maccabees is talking about Antiochus' persecution. Many in Israel remained strong, and despite their suffering, abstained from eating impure things. They undertook to die, so as not to be defiled by foods and not to desecrate the sacred covenant, and they died. And there was a very great wrath upon Israel, which means things are very bad. But if you wonder, how did they express their suffering? Not a word. We'll get back to this passage in another context later. Second Maccabees is written in what's normally called pathetic Greek style. Pathetic doesn't mean that we should be contemptuous of it. It means that it's meant to arouse our pathos. It's meant to arouse our feelings. Like here's a passage. This is my translation here. When somebody wants to rob the temple in 2 Maccabees 3, the anguish all over the city was quite considerable. The priests, throwing themselves before the altar in their priestly vestments, called to heaven upon him who legislated concerning deposits, to preserve them inviolate for their depositors in the temple. And it pierced the mind to see the high priest's face, for his appearance and the changes of coloration revealed the distress of his soul. For the man was inundated by fear and bodily trembling, through which the anguish present in his heart became apparent to his observers. You're supposed to be getting upset. It's like watching a play. Many came flocking out of their houses for a supplication by the entire population, in light of the fact that the place was going to be disgraced. Women, who are always good for arousing emotion, women bound around with sackcloth under their breasts, congregated in the streets. And of the closed-in virgins don't go outside. Some ran together to the gates, and some to the walls, while others peeked out through the windows. Imagine that. All of them making their entreaty, their hands stretched out to heaven. And anyone who saw the prostration of the entire community, like the readers, all mingled together, and the anxiety of the highly anguished high priest had to be moved to pity. That's what a pathetic narrative is supposed to do to its readers. So it's very different again from 1 Maccabees. As for topic, 1 Maccabees focuses on the Hasmonean dynasty, which is the new rulers of Judea. This is a little outline of 1 Maccabees on the board. It's got 16 chapters. The first chapter is the problem. There is foreign, Seleucid rule, and there are persecutions. And the next chapters are all the solution, which breaks down under one or the other of the Hasmoneans who takes over and runs the struggle against the Seleucids. Mattathias in chapter 2, and he dies in chapter 2. Judah takes over of chapters 3 to 9 when he dies. Jonathan until chapter 12 when he's taken prisoner and is killed. And Simon takes over in chapter 12. In chapter 14, there is a decision by the people to make Simon and his sons rulers forever. So at the end of chapter 16, when Simon is killed, his son John takes over, and the last words of the book are after his father, which means that the point of the book, the very bottom line of the book, is to show you how the dynasty came to be established and to convince you that it's appropriate, that it's worthy of ruling Judea because it maintained this struggle successfully over such a long time. So the book is a book of Hasmonean dynastic history, specifically of Simonide dynastic history, because beginning with Simon, it's his sons and his grandsons and his great-grandsons who are going to be at the head of the Hasmonean state as long as it lasted. Second Maccabees, in contrast, doesn't know about the Hasmonean dynasty. It was written probably when the dynasty was beginning, but it's not aware of it, or at least not interested in telling us about the Hasmonean dynasty. Rather, the structure of Second Maccabees is the story of a polis. I told you the first two chapters are introductory materials. You can read them on the side. The story begins in chapter 3 with the holy city being inhabited in complete peace. Right there, verse 1, the holy city. That's how it begins. And the laws being observed Optimally, due to the high priest's piety and hatred of evil, it happened that the kings themselves used to honor the place and aggrandize the temple with the most outstanding gifts, just as King Seleucus of Asia, Antiochus IV's brother, who preceded him, used to supply out of his own revenues all of the expenses incurred for the sacrificial offices. So once upon a time, things in the city were great. At the end of the story, after Judah Maccabee defeats the last Seleucid general who's described there, Nicanor, since the affairs concerning Nicanor turned out this way, and ever since the city was taken by the Hebrews, it has been in their hands, here I too will conclude this account. The author says, I was telling you about a story about the city, which began in a wonderful situation, ended in a wonderful situation. In the middle, there was an interesting story, and the story pertained to the city. The way the author tells the story, it's a story about the city. When Antiochus makes his decrees against the practice of what we might call Judaism or Jewish law, he says he forbade them politeoestai according to the divine laws. That's the same verb you might remember from Galatians, Paul saying he used to politeoestai according to Jewish law. Summarizing part one of my talk about basic characteristics, showing you that they are different books. First Maccabees is a Hebrew book. It focuses on the rise and establishment of a sovereign Judean dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty, and specifically the Simonide branch, in the 2nd century BCE. And that's what I would expect from a Judean book about a native dynasty. It's dynastic history from Judea. Second Maccabees is a Greek book. It focuses on the fate of the Jewish polis, as is to be expected from a Jew who lives in the Hellenistic diaspora, because a polis is a very central institution of the Hellenistic world. It imparts identity, it imparts culture, and the book says, we've got one too. It's called Jerusalem. And once upon a time, this barbaric Antiochus tried to attack it, like the Persian kings tried attacking Athens a few centuries ago, and we were able to overcome that. Not only does it sound like it's a book from the Hellenistic diaspora, but in chapter 2, in that preliminary material I skipped, the author of the book as we have it says, this book which we have is an abridged version of a longer work written by somebody called Jason of Cyrene, Jason of Libya, which means he tells us explicitly it's a book from the Hellenistic Jewish diaspora. Could I move some? I'm going to take a little water and move into the second part of what I have to say. If we conclude that one book is Judean, thank you, and one book is from the diaspora, what more does that suggest? Thank you. The first thing it suggests is interest in Judean geography. I don't expect Jews from the diaspora to have much interest in it or much knowledge about it. I expect an author from the land of Israel, specifically from Jerusalem, the Hasmonean court, where he's writing this dynastic history, to be interested in Judean geography and to expect his readers to find it interesting and meaningful. Maybe they know about the same places. This is a usual rule of all historiography. The further away the author is, the less the geographical details you're going to have, and vice versa. So in chapter 3, the force set out and encamped to the south of Emmaus, and the author doesn't tell anybody where Emmaus is. Or in chapter 4, Gorgias took with him 5,000 men and 1,000 select cavalry, and his force set out at night to assault the Judeans' camp and strike them suddenly. The men of the Acra, Seleucid fortress in Jerusalem, serving as their guides. But Judas and his men heard of it, and he set out along with his forces to strike the soldiers who were in Emmaus, while those soldiers were still dispersed outside the camp. When Gorgias reached Judas' camp at night, he found no one there, so he searched for them in the mountains, saying, "They have fled from us." But just as day broke, Judas became visible in the plain. And my point is that the readers have not been told which are the mountains or the plain. But if you live in Jerusalem, you know Or in chapter 9, everybody writes articles about the following verses. Alcimus returned to Jerusalem, and Bacchidus, who was with him, a Seleucid general, and built up powerful cities in Judea, the fortress in Jericho and Emmaus, Beit Choron, Beit El, Timnat, Pharaton, and Tephon, and everybody writes articles, where are some of these places? And can we find any remnants of these fortifications? He also fortified the city of Beit Sur and Gezer and the Akra. And you wonder why or what picture this gives you. And all of this is just to say that the opposite is the case for 2nd Maccabees. Here I have nothing to bring you from 2nd Maccabees. I bring you some quotes from modern scholars who all say that there's nothing there. So Wellhausen, for example, said already well more than 100 years ago, the author of 2nd Maccabees knows nothing of the geography of Palestine, gives no mention to supplement the toponyms, if at all he mentions any. So if now and then there's some toponym, it has no context, no meaning for the reader. Or my own teacher, Menachem Stern, wrote that the fog that covers in the book everything that concerns the geography and topography of the battles offers no support for the conjecture that the author was from the land of Israel. I gave up that conjecture already in the first part of the lecture, but Stern comes along and says it here as well. The map of Eretz Israel was totally foreign to the epitomist. The epitomist is the one who put together the current version of the book, the summary of that longer work by Jason of Syria. Correspondingly, but a little more surprisingly or perhaps bothersome for some of you, 2nd Maccabees, written by somebody far away, has relatively little interest in the Temple of Jerusalem. This is a somewhat controversial statement, but I stand by it. And why is that understandable? Because a Jew living in the diaspora could not participate in the cult of the Temple of Jerusalem. They might send a donation even once a year, but that doesn't cover the other 364 days of the year. When they want to ask God to forgive a sin or to send health or well-being to somebody, they assume that prayers are efficient, because if they have to assume that only sacrifices are sufficient, they're in big trouble because they can't bring sacrifices. And therefore, for example, when they come to write about even a story in Jerusalem about the temple, you can see that the author is less familiar with, less interested in. So when 1st Maccabees tells us that Antiochus robbed the temple, he says Antiochus robbed everything in red. The golden altar, the candelabrum, its appurtenances, the table of the presence, the libation cups, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns. These words must mean something for the readership. The author assumes people have seen these things. They know what they are. The same story in 2nd Maccabees says that he stole the holy vessels, whatever they might be. He's not polemicizing. He is upset about it. It's not right that Antiochus did this. And look what Antiochus did. Look what he has time to say. He taking the holy vessels with his abominable hands and seizing with his profane hands the votive offerings that had been given by other kings for the aggrandizement, honor, and respect of the place. He's underlining that the other kings all showed honor to the temple, and Antiochus stole the things they donated to the temple. That shows you that Antiochus is exceptional, because as a matter of fact, this is another major difference between a Judean work and a diasporic work, that let me start in this case here. Oh, actually, yeah, we'll do it this way. 2nd Maccabees says the Greek kings, by and large, are fine. Remember how the story began? The holy city being inhabited in complete peace, the kings are showing honor to the place. And specifically, the Seleucid king is even giving the budget for the sacrificial cult. Whereas 1st Maccabees is totally different. The very beginning of 1st Maccabees, those first 9-10 verses that I gave you colored with yellow, come out like this in English. After the successive offensive of Alexander, son of Philip the Macedonian, Alexander the Great, who had departed from the land of Kittim and defeated Darius, king of Persians, 1st Maccabees begins with the end of the biblical story with Darius, who's the last Persian king mentioned in the Bible. He started numerous wars, conquered fortresses, and slaughtered kings of the earth. That's very harsh language. He went to the ends of the earth, despoiling many peoples, and the world became quiet before him. He became arrogant, his heart soaring. So, from the very outset of the book, Alexander the Great is depicted as being a wicked, arrogant, cruel king. After a while, he dies in verse 7. Successors took power, and after his death, they all donned diadems, crowns. And I give you an asterisk, because later on in First Maccabees, he will praise the Romans who were so humble that none of them took a crown. He's writing during the Republic. So taking a crown is evidence for arrogance, and it's right here, which is why I've colored it in red. And so too they ruled, and so too their sons after them for many years, and they multiplied evil in the world. Out of them emerged a sinful growth, Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, Antiochus Epiphanes emerged in 175 BCE, which is where the story really begins. Alexander died, in 323 BCE, which means that 150 years of Hellenistic history are summarized as they multiplied evil in the world. So when Antiochus eventually appears now, out of them appeared a sinful growth, Antiochus Epiphanes. You wonder, why is he sinful? And the answer is because it's in his blood. It's in all of his training. All of the precedents that lay behind the appearance of Antiochus Epiphanes make him evil, which is what I would expect from a book which is produced as a dynastic history of a dynasty, a homegrown dynasty of Hasmoneans that is coming to rule Judea, because it has to explain to its readers, why do we need a new dynasty? If the Hellenistic kings, if the Seleucid kings were benevolent, if we were doing fine under them, then why rebel? So it makes sense for this Judean book to portray the Greek kings that way, just as much as it makes sense for the Jew living in the Hellenistic diaspora under Hellenistic kings, and we hear of no persecution of Jews in the Hellenistic period. It makes sense for them to think that's just fine. It certainly makes sense for them to write in Greek, which their neighbors can read, that they think it's fine, but it makes sense for them indeed to think it's fine, because they're doing well under non-Jewish rule. And not only are foreign kings fine, according to 2nd Maccabees, and terrible according to 1st Maccabees, also foreigners, non-Jews in general, are like that as well. 1st Maccabees chapter 5, we saw this passage before in another context. When the Gentiles round about heard that the altar had been built and the temple rededicated as they previously were, they were wrathful and decided to wipe out the people of Jacob in their midst. So when the Jews are doing well, that's reason for the Jews' neighbors to try to exterminate them. And at the end of chapter 12, Jonathan is taken prisoner, and the Jews are really in a bad way because their leader has been taken prisoner by the enemy general. And all of them came safely to the land of Judah, and they mourned Jonathan and those who were with him, and they were very afraid. And all of Israel mourned greatly. The Jews are in a very bad way. And all the Gentiles who were around them sought to wipe them out, for they said, "They have neither ruler nor ally. So let us now make war against them and destroy mankind's memory of them." Which means that according to 1st Maccabees, Gentiles want to exterminate the Jews when they're doing well and when they're doing poorly. That's what they're like. And that makes sense again, because if I have to convince people to serve in a Judean army, which is fighting the neighbors of the Judeans, they better believe those neighbors are terrible people and they want to destroy us. 2nd Maccabees chapter 4 tells at one point about the murder of a Jewish high priest. in Antioch. A wicked Jew gave a bribe to a wicked Gentile, and he went and he murdered a Jewish high priest, Onias, in Antioch. For this reason, not only Jews, but also many of other nations were outraged and vexed about the unjust murder of the man. So when the king returned from the Cilician regions, the king was out of town. Obviously, had the king been in town, something like that couldn't have happened. When the king came back, he was petitioned by the Jews of the city, joined by the Greeks out of hatred for evil, concerning the unreasonable murder of Onias. This is all very universalistic terminology. It's unreasonable to murder somebody. It's unjust to murder Onias. Onias, it's unjust to murder him, not because he's a Jew or a high priest, but because he's a man. And it's unjust to murder men. And the non-Jews recognize that. And especially the Greeks, it's important for me to say, they recognize that. We Jews and Greeks, we all share the same basic values of the value of human life, justice, reason. That's 2 Maccabees. It's the author who's living in a Hellenistic diaspora where his neighbors are non-Jews, and he's living with them successfully and well. He's assuming that they respect him and he respects them because they all share basic values. They're different. They live according to different codes. He calls his code Judaismos, as we'll see, Judaism. But they share basic human values. And similarly, at the end of chapter 4, when some other Jews are killed for the wrong reason, the Tyrians, namely the non-Jewish Greek citizens of Tyre on the coast of Lebanon, out of their hatred for evil, munificently supplied the funeral expenses. They act out of hatred of evil, just like the people in the first story hate out of hatred for evil. That's something which is shared by all good people. They hate evil, according to 2 Maccabees. And one more detail in the second part of my lecture. It's a detail, it's a somewhat technical point, but it does have to do with the difference between Judea and the diaspora. Shall Jews fight wars on the Sabbath? You know, fighting a war entails all sorts of labors which are normally forbidden on the Sabbath. On the other hand, if you don't fight on the Sabbath, every war will end within 7 days. Somebody in the second row just went, like, what kind of nonsense is this? How could you imagine not fighting a war on the Sabbath? Every war would finish within a week with the defeat of the Jews if they refused to defend themselves on the Sabbath. 1 Maccabees chapter 2 has a story right about this. It talks about pious people from Jerusalem who go down to the Judean desert because they don't want to be defiled by Antiochus' decrees against Judaism. And the Seleucid army finds them, and it happens to be on the Sabbath, and attacks them, and they refuse to defend themselves, and they all die. They say, we shall die in our innocence. In other words, we won't die having committed the sin of fighting on the Sabbath. We shall die in our innocence. And 1,000 of them die. When Mattathias, namely the rebel, the hero of the book, and his companions learned of this, they mourned over them greatly, and they said to one another, if we all do like our brethren and do not fight the Gentiles for our lives and our laws, they will now swiftly wipe us off the face of the earth. We're going to die. So they deliberated and they decided, in other words, they had a formal decision. If any man comes to make war against us on the Sabbath day, we will fight against him, lest we all die, as our brethren did in the hiding places. And several times in 1 Maccabees, this is illustrated, specifically at times when the enemy attacks the Jews, thinking they won't defend themselves or won't be ready for war on the Sabbath, and are surprised to discover that they are prepared and do defend themselves. 2 Maccabees, a book from the Diaspora, which means a book from a place where the readers of the book and their children are not going to ever be serving in a Jewish army, doesn't really have the dilemma of the sanctity of the Sabbath vis-a-vis the sanctity of human life, because there's no real situation which calls upon them to choose. It is important for the author of 2 Maccabees to emphasize just how important it is to observe the Sabbath. And therefore the author comes very close to saying it is forbidden to fight on the Sabbath. Some scholars will tell you he forbids it. He certainly is pointing in that direction. Time and again, I give you the passages here, the author says just how terrible it is to fight on the Sabbath. That is functional in the diaspora because they're not going to abstain from fighting on the Sabbath as a result of that, because they're not going to be fighting anyways. They will, however, have gotten some instruction about just how important it is to observe the Sabbath. If I summarize part 2 of my talk, so first Maccabees is what's expected from Jews in Judea under Judean rule, with Jewish neighbors where they live. I should have written here, and Gentile neighbors just over the border. Second Maccabees is what's expected from Jews abroad living under Jewish rule, under non-Jewish rule, with non-Jewish neighbors. I could leave it here, and I won't. I'll say there's more. I say the difference between these 2 points of view is so great that I tend not to call them the difference between Jews in Judea and Jews in abroad, but rather the difference between Judeans and Jews, so as to emphasize the gap between them. And this is the cover of a book I wrote. On the side of writing commentaries on 1st and 2nd Maccabees, I started thinking beyond that and wrote more broadly about the distinction between Judeans and Jews and dichotomy in ancient Jewish history. So let's talk about Judea versus Judaism. And the first instance I'll talk about is like the thing we were just talking about, defending yourself on the Sabbath or not. For 1st Maccabees, it's important to claim and to illustrate that martyrs don't solve anything. Martyrs show you how bad the problem is. They don't solve the problem. So at the very end of chapter 1 that we saw before, where men and women are being killed and babies are being hung from their mothers because they are all observing Jewish law and violating Antiochus's decrees, they died. And there was great wrath in Israel. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 begins. Mattathias steps up, and he has 5 sons, and they do something else entirely. In the middle of chapter 2, we saw it before. People allow themselves to be killed rather than defending themselves on the Sabbath. Mattathias and his men decide, we're not going to be like that. Chapter 7, you have people called pious. Maybe it's with a upper class P. Asidaioi, Hasidim. Maybe it's a lower class P. Pious people. And scribes, grammates, are very impressed by a Seleucid general who is promising peace. And they go to make peace with him. But Judah Maccabee and his men, they don't make peace with them because they see they're coming with a big army. And indeed, once those pious people go make their peace with the Syrian army, the general turns around and kills 60 of them, which shows that they are naive. They don't understand what Judah Maccabee and smart people understand, which means the author of 1st Maccabees has 3 occasions in which he shows that the pious people chose the wrong route. The pious people do the wrong thing, and the people who get things done are the ones who get out there and fight rather than being pious. The third one is particularly nasty because it shows them as being naive. For 2nd Maccabees, chapters 6 and 7 are long stories of martyrdom. Eleazar is an old man. I talked about him before being like Socrates. After him in chapter 6, you have in chapter 7 a mother with 7 sons, One after the other, they are tortured and killed and have a speech. And in the end, she is killed as well. A lot of space is given to them. And that's because they are, as my friend Jan Willem van Hunten called them in his book about that, they are the saviors of the Jewish people, according to 2 Maccabees, because what happens is that after you have persecutions in chapters 5 and 6, and martyrdom in chapters 6 and 7, at the end of the long chapter 7, the author says, last of all, the mother died after her sons. Let this be enough then about the eating of sacrifices and the extreme tortures. And chapter 8 draws the conclusion from chapter 6 and 7. It's not going in a different direction, like 1 Maccabees 2 goes in a different direction from chapter 1 and turns to the rebels instead of the martyrs. In 2 Maccabees, chapter 8 has the rebels be victorious because the martyrs made that happen. But Judas, who was also called Maccabeus, and his companions secretly entered the villages and summoned their kinsmen and enlisted those who continued in the Jewish faith, Judaismos. And so they gathered about 6,000 men. They besought the Lord to look upon the people who were oppressed by all, to have pity on the temple which had been profaned by ungodly men, to have mercy on the city which was being destroyed and about to be leveled to the ground, and to hearken to the blood that cried out to them. The blood of these martyrs is calling out from the ground. And to remember also the lawless destruction of the innocent babies. In chapter 7, it doesn't really sound like they're babies, it sounds like they're young boys. But the rhetoric here is they're like babies and they were killed. And the blasphemies committed against his name, and to show his hatred for evil. And you see that the Greeks in Antioch and the Greeks in Tyre and God himself all share the same value of hatred of evil. And God, in fact, agrees. As soon as Maccabeus got his army organized, the Gentiles could not withstand him, for the wrath of the Lord had turned to mercy. Martyrdom was effective. Martyrdom made things happen. And I mentioned before that there's one complex of verses from the Hebrew Bible which is very functional in 2 Maccabees. It's Deuteronomy 32, the Song of Moses, where the Jews are protected by God. When they're sinful, he turns away from them. When their blood is spilt, he turns again to them. Those verses are played with in 2 Maccabees time and again. Paragraph 1a of martyrdom. I call it 1a and not 2 because it goes together with paragraph 1, which was martyrdom, resurrection. First Maccabees has not a word about life after death of any type, neither continued immortality or resurrection. Second Maccabees has quite a bit. You have it in the speeches in chapter 7, where the mother is encouraging her seventh son to be killed like his brothers. She prays that God will in mercy return to you both spirit and life. Or in chapter 12, when Judah Maccabee wins a battle, but some of his men die on the battlefield, and he discovers they had been sinful. I'll say something about that in a moment. He collects money to bring sacrifices on their behalf in Jerusalem, so as to atone for their sins after they're dead. And the author underlines this means that he is demonstrating his taking account of resurrection in verse 43. For had he not expected that the fallen would be resurrected, it would have been pointless and silly to pray for the dead. So the author of 2 Maccabees is emphatic about his belief in resurrection. In chapter 14, we have a scene with a martyr again calling upon God to return life and spirit to him. This goes together with martyrdom because it somehow encourages people, don't worry, this isn't the end. There's some inclarity in 2 Maccabees, and particularly Catholic scholars have been interested because it's part of sacred scripture. Does it refer, in fact, to immortality and eventual resurrection, or does it refer to immediate resurrection? And people write books about that, but it's doesn't matter right now. First Maccabees, what you see is what you get. When the guy dies, he is dead. My second point has to do with what causes suffering. Both books are about a lot of Jewish suffering. A lot of Jews are killed, temple is profaned, things are stolen, terrible years. What makes that happen? For First Maccabees, it's clear that what makes that happen are the Gentiles round about. We've got wicked neighbors. Maybe they can't help it because they're goyim, they're Gentiles, but we've got wicked neighbors and they make life difficult for us. Some of them are even kings, and they're wicked kings. There are also renegade Jews. There are Jews who are not loyal to Judaism, and they're bad too, and we kill them when we can, or we expel them when we can. That's what First Maccabees has to say. And furthermore, First Maccabees has a third explanation. Sometimes things just go wrong because of the kairos, which I would translate as luck. When Judah Maccabee dies in chapter 9, his men want to flee the field of battle because they see there are too many Syrians arrayed against them. He says, no, men don't flee the field of battle. We will fight. And if given the kairos, we shall die with honor. Well, you could find things like that in Homer. You find that in First Maccabees. Several times in First Maccabees, you have that as well. So it's either our wicked neighbors or our wicked kings or the bad luck cause trouble. Second Maccabees 3 times addresses his readers. 3 times in Second Maccabees, the author steps aside from the narrative and says, now, dear reader, I want to explain. And they're here on the slide in chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6. And in each case, he says, it's the Jews' sinfulness. The fact that the Jews have been sinful that has caused God to turn aside. This is most clear in chapter 5. In chapter 4, he says, bad things are going to happen because of sinfulness. In chapter 5, he says, bad things are happening. And look what he says in chapter 5. Antiochus' mind went soaring. After Antiochus robs the temple, he was really happy. He thought he was very successful. For he did not see that it was due to the sins of the city's residents and that the sovereign, God, briefly distanced himself from it in anger. And that was why there was a looking away from the place. Looking away is the way the author refers to what Deuteronomy 32 calls hiding of the face. You know, if you're walking and you've got a little child walking in front of him, you should watch. If you turn away, bad things can happen. That's what you have here. God turned his face away. Bad things happened to the Jews because God wasn't watching. God wasn't watching because they were sinful. When enough martyrs' blood is spilt to get God's wrath to turn to mercy, he will revert to his providential protection of the Jews, and things will turn up again. Here we have the Gentiles round about. We had it once already. Let's turn to number 3. Judea versus Judaism. Is God active in the world? I'll say it now so I don't forget. My impression is you can't talk about Judaism or any religion if your answer to that question is no. First Maccabees has no divine providence, not literally and not as far as I can see by inference. No miracles. No apparitions, nothing appearing in heaven as a vision. No angels. Lots of all of them in Second Maccabees. Judah Maccabee goes out to war. There's an angel up in heaven leading the way. Judah Maccabee goes out to war in that last chapter where he finally defeats Nicanor. Onias, the high priest who was murdered in Antioch, and Jeremiah, the prophet, appear together in heaven and give him a sword, which he uses. It's a real sword, and he uses it. First Maccabees has no poetic justice, or I'll say there's one exception. If you want to, you can ask me about it. There's something of an exception in chapter 9. No cases of poetic justice, which means it doesn't happen that the way things happen corresponds to the way things began. Punishments don't fit the crime in 1 Maccabees. Punishments fit the crime in 2 Maccabees time and again. When Menelaus is killed in chapter 13 by being pushed into some machine which burns him up in the ashes, the author says that's because in chapter 4 he defiled the holy ashes on the altar in the temple. And you're supposed to realize, the way things work shows that there's not just chance in the world. Rather, somebody is pulling the strings and make things happen. So even when there's no explicit statement of divine intervention, it is implied in 2 Maccabees time and again. Lysimachos is killed by a mob in Jerusalem, and as it happened, he was killed by the temple treasury, which is appropriate because he had robbed the temple treasury. Things like that. And 1 Maccabees emphasizes on 2 or 3 occasions that there are no prophets anymore. In chapter 4, when they purify the temple, they've got stones which were part of the original altar, but in the meantime they've been defiled. And you can't really throw them out because they were once sacred stones, but you can't really use them because they're defiled. What are we supposed to do with them? So they put them aside until a prophet will come and tell them what to do. Later on in the book, when things are really bad, in chapter 9, the times are as bad as they've ever been since prophets ceased to appear in Israel. And in chapter 14, when Simon and his sons are appointed to be rulers of Judea forever, they say, well, forever until a prophet appears. I don't imagine the Hasmoneans were looking forward to the appearance of a prophet because they had what they wanted without a prophet. But in any case, they emphasize. So if there are no prophets, there are no miracles, there are no angels, there are no apparitions, and things happen by chance in the world, and Kairos makes things happen now and then, it's a very different book from a book about Judaism. And what about man turning to God? I was talking now about God turning to man. In 1 Maccabees, there are very, very few prayers, especially after chapter 4. Until chapter 4, 1 Maccabees is somewhat different from the rest of the book in a few ways. And there are some prayers in the first chapters of the book, particularly in chapter 3 and 4. Afterwards, they're not there. In the entire book, there's no reference to Theos nor to Kyrios. Namely, there's no reference to God or the Lord. There are a few references to Uranos, heaven, especially in the first chapters. After chapter 4, they are very, very few, and I would characterize them as window dressing. They don't really mean much. When Simon sends his children out to war in the very end of the book, he says, "May heaven be with you." It's a very cheap phrase. I'm familiar with lots of people who say similar things in modern Hebrew today and have no reason to imply that heaven exists, much less that it can help anybody. 2 Maccabees is full of prayers, and they're effective. People pray and things happen, just like you saw martyrdom and things happen. And there are scores of references in the book to God, whether as Theos or Kyrios. What about Judaism, this more general thing, which builds on all of these other things which I say are not there in 1 Maccabees and are there in 2 Maccabees? Well, the very term Judaismos is found in 2 Maccabees in 3 different passages, which I put here on the board as part of the table of contents of the work in chapter 2. In chapter 8, we've already seen this, that Judah Maccabee called the people together who had remained in Judaism, which shows it's a voluntary thing. You can choose to remain in Judaism or choose not to. It's not something natural, it's something artificial. And for 2 Maccabees, it's important to underline it. And in chapter 14, also, there is a martyr who in the past had remained faithful to Judaism, and now when push came to shove, he was willing to be a martyr for Judaism as well. Second Maccabees is the oldest known text to use the word Judaismos. It could be the author invented it. It could be the term was common in the Jewish community wherever the guy was living, probably in Alexandria in Egypt. But in any case, it's an important term for the book. It's that for which these people are fighting. And it's the ism of Judea. It's not Judea. It's the ism of it, something abstract, which we've seen what that amounts to. So coming towards the end, I'll say, so how shall we characterize First Maccabees? A book that's all about a Judean state. It has dynastic heroes and shows how good they are by contrasting them with naive martyrs. It attributes successes and defeats to luck. Has nothing to say about God, Lord, Judaism, angels, sin and atonement, resurrection, miracles, apparition, and, especially after the first chapters, very little to say about heaven or prayer. I would characterize it as a Judean book, in contrast to Second Maccabees, which is a Jewish book. And I would hesitate to add Jewish to the characterization of First Maccabees as well. I have here, I think this is the third slide from the end, passages from two modern commentators on First Maccabees. Avram Kahana was an important scholar in Palestine in the first part of the 20th century. Very learned man, published lots of works, including a translation and commentary on First Maccabees. And in his commentary on First Maccabees, he writes, its author wrote in Hebrew, he emphasized that, and precisely in the style of the biblical books, for he was very well at home in them and full of their spirit. As such, he was able to write a book that is something of another link in the chain of the holy book itself. I find that statement difficult. He's right about it being in Hebrew. He's right about the author writing in the style of the biblical books. He's right about the author being at home in them. But the spirit of the book, I think, is very different from what we usually find in the Hebrew Bible. And I would prefer what was written by Carl Grimm in 1853 in the preface to his commentary. This is my translation of his German. Since the book is about First Maccabees, since the book's character and tone of its story are, like its language, simple and like those of the Hebrew Bible, alttestamentlich, the book is usually compared in this respect to the books of Samuel and Kings. And then he writes, only in one not insignificant point. Nur in einem nicht unwesentlichen Punkt. I would love to see his face when he wrote that. Only in one not insignificant point does it differ from the old Israelite historiography, namely that, in contrast with the old theological pragmatism, in other words, the way theology used to explain events, it no longer presents events in a supernatural light and no longer allows God, following a specific plan and directing events in miraculous ways, to move in and out through the webs of natural causation. And you all spend your time studying the Bible. You tell me how alttestamentlich can you be if you don't tell about events in a supernatural light. So to summarize, I would say that there was a Hebrew Bible. It had its language, its style, its spirits, and its values. And when you get down to the 2nd century BCE, 2 books are written by Jews in different parts of the world. One of them who preserves spirit and values, but not style and not language, and writes a book in Greek. And I would say it's a book by and for Jews. And one of them which preserves the language and the style, but not the spirit and the values, and that's First Maccabees, written by and for Judeans. One last word on canonical status. I'll talk about Jews, Catholics, and Protestants. The ancient rabbis never considered including 1st or 2nd Maccabees in the biblical canon. We have discussions in the Mishnah about what's in and what's out of the Bible. 1st and 2nd Maccabees were never discussed. Both were excluded, obviously, because obviously they deal with the 2nd century BCE, And the rabbis had this rule, for whatever reason, that the last prophets were in the Persian period. Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, they were all well before the Hellenistic period, so you can't have an inspired book in the 2nd century. Moreover, 2nd Maccabees wouldn't even get to first base because it was written in Greek, and the rabbis never imagined having a book in Greek in the Hebrew Bible. But they were part of the Septuagint. Whoever was preserving ancient Hebrew books that are interesting included 1st and 2nd Maccabees in the Septuagint. And that's how it happened that they became part of the Christian Bible, and were even ratified by the Council of Trent in 1546 as being part of the Bible and full-fledged part of the Bible, and that's where they are today in a Catholic Bible. The Council of Trent had to deal with that because of Luther and others who were insisting on separating out the Apocrypha from the rest of the sacred scriptures. And particularly regarding the Maccabees, Luther had something to say in his forewords to the book. He has a foreword to 1st Maccabees, which I don't quote from here, and he has a foreword to 2nd Maccabees. And at the end of his foreword to 2nd Maccabees, he writes, to sum up, just as it is proper for the first book to be included among the sacred scriptures, so it is proper that the second book should be thrown out, even though it contains some good things. So it has some good things, but he was unhappy about suicide in chapter 14 of 2nd Maccabees. He was unhappy about purgatory in chapter 12 of 2nd Maccabees. So he wants to throw 2nd Maccabees out. However, the whole thing is left and referred to the pious reader to judge and to decide. From my point of view, Luther got things backward. As long as you don't care about the rabbi's criteria, namely the date of the book, post-Persian period, and the language of the book, Greek, I see no reason not to include 2nd Maccabees in sacred scripture. But 1st Maccabees, it seems to me very difficult to justify its inclusion in sacred scripture. Translations and commentaries typically solve the problem by simply adding God into the text. And you read, for example, Luther's translation of 1st Maccabees. He's got 39 mentions of Gott, not to mention a whole lot of other allusions to Gott by references to the Gottesdienst and Gottlos and things like that. You go to the Einheitsübersetzung, which is used in the German-speaking world. It's got lots of references to God. None of them have any equivalent in the Greek text of the book. King James has lots of references to God. The Revised Standard Version got rid of them, and the book then becomes more godless. So I wonder, and I leave this to you as a question, just like Luther said, it's left to the pious reader to judge and to decide. Do you have any better way of handling the problem posed by 1st Maccabees being a part of sacred scripture? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Schwartz, for this really inspiring talk. And I will not take more time because I think that there are many questions that you would like to ask. I will take two questions and then we will let Professor Schwartz answer. Please, when you ask questions, introduce yourself.
Hi, good morning. Thank you. My name is Eric. I'm from the Cardinal Bea Centre, and I'm very lucky to have Professor Schwartz in my class. So this topic is really fascinating, and I think originally I was very interested in the canonical status of the books, but I think you've already covered that in the very last part. But my question is for you specifically, what is your opinion in terms of can we say that this division between Jews and Judeans for one book and the other, respectively, influenced also the use that were given to the books? In the sense, for instance, I'm thinking about that, if I understand correctly, during the medieval period, for instance, not much was referenced about the first book, but the second book, for instance, was much used to justify the Crusades and other kind of political decisions. So is this something that can be inferred from this original distinction? What is your take on it? Thank you.
What is your opinion about the fact that the second Maccabees is a summary of another big books from whom we have no trace? For my opinion, it is not just a literary stratagem of an author to say that it is a resume of a bigger book. What is your opinion on the fact? I think you must have some.
Thank you for two questions. The first question had to do with the use and reception of these books. I think in general, well, first let me clear the deck. There is very, very little Jewish reception of either book in antiquity. In the modern period, apropos of Zionism and states, Jews started getting interested. But Josephus used First Maccabees a lot, but Jews had very little reception of Josephus too. There's a lot of Christian use in the first centuries of Second Maccabees, very little of First Maccabees. If you go to the Biblia Patristica, those volumes which index verses from the Bible that are cited in patristic literature, you have pages and pages of references to Second Maccabees, and very, very little from First Maccabees, because Christian writers were not interested in a state. And they were interested in martyrdom. They were interested in theological topics, like one of the martyrs in chapter 7 says something which sounds like a statement of creatio ex nihilo. So that's quoted frequently, things like that. When you get to the Crusades, First Maccabees has something of a renaissance, both in literature and in art, because you have crusaders who are portraying themselves as a new Judah Maccabee, new Judas Maccabeus. And for that, First Maccabees is more useful than Second Maccabees. So I think that's basically what I have to say about reception. The other question was, what do I think about the statement by the author of Second Maccabees in chapter 2, that the work which he has given us is an abridgment of a much longer work by Jason of Cyrene, a work for which we have no other evidence. And I didn't catch your name, sir. Was expressed doubt that it ever existed. Vincent? Okay. Well, okay. So I have no idea. The only attempt that I know to prove that Second Maccabees is in fact an abridgment of something could be in one of two ways. Either the style of Second Maccabees shows it's an abridgment, or there's something in Second Maccabees which is a result of clumsy abridgment. If we had a reference in Second Maccabees which something the readers are supposed to know about, but the readers don't know about it, I'm unaware of any example of the second type. I don't know of any even attempt, or I can't remember now, any attempt to prove from what's in Second Maccabees that it assumes something else is there which isn't there. So I'm going to leave that aside. The style, there have been a few attempts to show that the style has many more prepositions, participles, many more participles than standard Greek prose of its day. And what's good about participles is they allow you to take one sentence into another. They allow you to summarize something while you're going on. Instead of saying, he went someplace, he did something, you can say, having gone, he did. And you save some words. There are studies like that, but I'm not really very convinced that they prove very much. And in my own work on Second Maccabees, I simply call the person who put the current book together the author, and I ignore Jason. So whether he existed, but we ignore him, it's sort of like the question, did Luke ever read Josephus? Shearer wrote, he doesn't know if Luke ever read Josephus, but if he did, he forgot everything he read before he wrote. Yeah, so it's that type of thing.
Thank you. We have one question there and one there.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the talk. I have a question about whether you detect any polemical dynamic between these two books. Do you see Second Maccabees trying to respond or argue against, or maybe be anti-Hasmonean? I don't know. Do you see anything like that?
The short answer is no. Excuse me. There'll be a second question and then a longer answer.
Vasile Babota. Of course, First Maccabees in Greek is a translation, and we don't really know how its Hebrew forlag look like and what has changed in between.